have a lot of things going on, shall we say, in your day today with all the visitors.
Здравствуйте, спасибо, что пришли, что подождали. Я знаю, что вы люди занятые.
May I ask a favor of you immediately?
Можно я вас попрошу об одолжении немедленно, прямо сейчас?
I haven't hit anyone in so long. It's safe for you if you would come up a little closer. I don't want to feel like I have to speak way in the back of the room. Could you come up a little closer?
Я уже давно никого не бил, поэтому прошу всех, кто сидит сзади, прийти поближе.
Thank you. Спасибо. And may I ask another question of you? If I speak this way, do all of you understand English?
Если я буду говорить вот так, все ли понимают по-английски?
Huh? I don't want to put my interpreter out of business, but I would love to have would that be possible or no?
Чтобы не делать лишнюю работу. Кому-то нужен перевод?
No. Okay. All right. In that case, I have an ambitious PowerPoint slide because of the time it will take for translation. So I will parse some of that down so that we will be sure to cover what I want to talk about.
У меня была большая презентация, но перевод займет лишнее время, поэтому тогда придется часть презентации пропустить.
This, first of all, this is not my first time in St. Petersburg. I was here before.
Я не первый раз в Петербурге.
It's as beautiful as ever.
Он по-прежнему прекрасен.
But it's very different because the last time I was here was 25 years ago.
Но он очень изменился, потому что я тут был 25 лет назад.
But I have very fond memories of my first visit, and I'm sure I will take away equally fond memories this time.
Мне здесь очень понравилось в тот раз, и я уверена, что сейчас будет не хуже.
Now, as for who I am a political scientist, actually, at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. I'm standing in front of my PowerPoint slide.
Я политолог в Университете Джорджа Вашингтона, как написано у меня в презентации.
George Washington University is a private university in Washington. We are literally in the heart of the city. We are next door to the White House, kind of next door to the State Department. The World Bank is one block over from me, so we are in the midst of everything in Washington.
Это частный университет в самом сердце столицы, прямо рядом с Белым домом, Госдепартаментом и Мировым банком. В центре всего.
I should also mention I'm at a think tank called the Brookings Institution, which is a Washington establishment as well.
Я также вхожу в рабочую группу Brookings Institution, она тоже входит в состав этого института.
So I'm here to talk to you today about the American elections, the presidential elections in particular.
Я должен поговорить с вами о выборах в Америке, в частности президентских.
And the structure of my talk has to do with what many would understand to be the mystery unfolding having to do with the American elections. They are not turning out, have not so far turned out entirely as we would have expected them to. We could say really the question is why Donald Trump and why is Bernie Sanders as successful as he has been?
Я хочу поговорить о той таинственности, которой окружены американские выборы. Они никогда не ведут себя так, как мы от них ожидаем. И я должен пытаться ответить на вопрос, почему Трамп и Сандерс добились такого успеха.
The conventional wisdom a year ago would have had it that the two contenders. Maybe we should turn the lights off a little bit.
Может быть, немножко притушим свет?
The conventional wisdom would have had it that the former governor of the state of Florida, whose last name is Bush, Jeb Bush, would be the Republican nominee, and then the conventional wisdom also would have had former Senator, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, the uncontested or nearly uncontested nominee of the Democratic Party.
В прошлом году все думали, что от республиканцев будет бывший губернатор Флориды Джеб Буш, а от демократов у Хиллари Клинтон не будет конкурентов вообще.
That hasn't happened. And so what happened? Why are we where we are? This is probably okay.
Но этого не случилось, и почему же все вышло так, как вышло?
The answer to that, in part, has to do with the internet, the role of social media, the role of the internet. This is an important point, so let's make sure we get it right.
Отчасти ответственность несет роль интернета, социальных СМИ, это важный момент.
But it's my view and the view of other political scientists who study politics and media and information that media, the internet, are merely tools, and the more important part of the explanation has to do with politics.
Но я и другие опытные политологи считаем, что интернет и социальные сети это не более чем инструмент, а корень вопроса лежит в политике.
If you wanted to put it in social science terms, the internet is not an independent variable, a causal variable, it's an intermediating variable. Other things affect how the internet itself is used, which in turn then has a political
Если
effect.
говорить в терминах социологии, то интернет это не самостоятельная переменная, а промежуточная.
So the question then that we are led to is, what are the main features of politics that's leading to this particular outcome at this particular point in time?
Итак, вопрос, какие политические моменты привели к тому, что вот все получилось так, как получилось?
Let me say immediately, there is no way I can do justice to a topic as complex as the one I've just set up in the time we have through interpretation.
Сразу должен говориться, ни в коем случае я за такое короткое время, да еще с переводом, не смогу раскрыть столь сложную тему.
If we had more time, we would go back and look at the history of changes in the composition of the Republican and Democratic Party going back to the early 1960s and all kinds of other historical anecdotes.
Если бы у нас было время, мы бы поговорили об истории изменения состава обеих партий еще с 1960-х годов и еще много о чем.
Instead, what I'm going to do is come forward and just pick up a couple of the important points that I think are important for us to understand why the American election is looking as it does, or as it is at this point in time. And one place to begin is with the events of 2008.
Я ограничусь парой важных обстоятельств, из-за которых, как я считаю, американские выборы происходят так, как они происходят.
The global economic crisis, the economic collapse of 2008 still reverberates through American politics and, frankly, global politics.
Глобальный экономический кризис, экономический коллапс 2008 года продолжает оказывать влияние на мировую американскую политику.
This is a graph that simply depicts what happened in the late months of 2008. This is the stock market crash.
Вот это график поведения фондового рынка в конце 2008 года, как он рухнул.
I want to convey the enormity of this event.
Я хочу подчеркнуть, насколько огромным было это событие.
There's a lot of language up here. I never put too many words on the slide. I violated that rule, but it's so important to get across the significance of the collapse of such things as home equity, the value of homes in the United States, and I'm talking very directly so you can just translate the slide, from 13 trillion to dropped to $8.8 trillion.
Очень много текста, я нарушил правила, что в презентации нельзя много писать, но просто чтобы подчеркнуть всю колоссальность этого события, стоимость жилого фонда упала с 13 до 8,8 триллионов долларов.
In just a year's time, the top half here, you can see that that Americans lost an average of something approximating a quarter of their net worth.
По подсчетам, американцы потеряли около четверти стоимости всего, что у них было.
This is a number that's hard to even imagine. 14 trillion, not billion, trillion dollars.
Число, которое невозможно даже вообразить. 14 не миллиардов, а триллионов долларов.
Can you do the math? What is the exchange rate with rubles? 60 rubles to a dollar? 65 rubles to a dollar? So multiply that by 65, and you'll have a sense of how much value was lost in rubles.
Представьте себе, сколько в рублях потеряли стоимость имущества.
So this sort of trauma is still, I'm arguing, and others argue, these are not ideas original to me, are reverberating through the American electoral process.
Я и не только я убеждены, что эти процессы продолжают оказывать влияние на американский выборный процесс.
At the same time, there have been other economic factors that I think and others think are affecting the current election, and that's really what I'm trying to get across. Is if the internet is important, if online social media is important, why and how? What are the contexts that allow for the kinds of messages that are being used to be effective?
Однако на выборный процесс продолжают оказывать влияние другие экономические факторы. Мы пытаемся ответить на вопрос, почему интернет и социальные сети получили возможность доносить тот месседж, который они доносят.
So really what I'm trying to say is, what might explain the success of a Donald Trump and a Bernie Sanders unexpectedly, and I think a part of the answer has to be to economic factors such as I've described so far.
Другими словами, мы пытаемся ответить на вопрос, что объясняет неожиданный успех Дональда Трампа и Берни Сандерса, и первый фактор, как мы считаем, экономический.
And the other part of the equation is since 2008, there's been a growing awareness of another economic reality, not just to the United States, but around the world. This is just not an American experience. It's also, I suspect, a Russian experience and a European experience, and that is the growing disparity in wealth between the haves and the have-nots.
И с 2008 года растет понимание другой экономической реальности, не только в Америке, но и в мире, и это разрыв доходов между богатыми и бедными.
These numbers come from the United States government. They come from the Federal Reserve Bank.
Это данные Федерального резервного банка, американского правительства.
And so you can see, and again, I think it would be easiest for you just to maybe point out the richest 4%.
Самый богатый 20% владеет 80% всех финансовых активов. Самый богатый 1% американцев владеет 34% от общего благосостояния страны. Следующие 19% владеют 50%. Таким образом, первые 20% американцев владеют 85% богатства страны, а нижние 80% всего 15%.
So you can see here that there are reasons for a lot of Americans to be anxious, to be concerned, and I think that is the backdrop for the current election cycle. And this is not something that has gone unnoticed even by the mainstream news media. This is The Atlantic, which is a venerable, again, mainstream. There's nothing radical one way or the other about The Atlantic. It's vanilla. And this is a recent article where they are asking the question, how have Wall Street bankers stayed out of jail?
Таким образом, у американцев есть основания для обеспокоенности, и мейнстримовые, крупнейшие респектабельные СМИ также не могли это обстоятельство проигнорировать. Вот статья в журнале «Атлантик» называется «Как банкиры смогли избежать тюрьмы».
Some of the indication in surprising how much this has been an issue resting in the background of American politics. This is, up until the publication of this book, a rather obscure French economist who published a 700-page book, and it became the #1 New York Times bestseller the year before last, or I've lost track. This is astounding. This is not the sort of reading material that makes its way to the top of the list of the most popular books in the United States, but yet it was. And the point of Thomas Piketty's book is the structural forces that are leading to the growth of inequality in the economy.
Вот один из экономических бестселлеров. Обычно такого рода книги не становятся популярными. А за год до этого еще книжка французского экономиста, 720 страниц, очень хорошо раскупалась.
Okay, so what I've suggested is that there are these economic, political anxieties and concerns that are rippling through American politics right now, and I'm suggesting that a part of the explanation, I want to step back for a second and say there is much, much more to be said, but I only have time for this, that this is one of the driving forces behind American elections this cycle.
Сейчас американская политика подернута вот этой рябью экономической и политической обеспокоенности. Это далеко не единственная причина экономическая, но, к сожалению, больше нет времени для того, чтобы сказать, но есть и другие причины.
And so this is I pulled this from this morning. This talk is brand new. I put this together this morning. And so you can see here, this is Senator Sanders' website, and right on the front page, where the very first page you see of Sanders' website is break up the largest financial institutions.
Вот совсем свежая тема. Сегодня утром на сайте Сандерса предложение разрушить крупнейшие финансовые институты.
So he is tapping into, and I want to come back and draw some distinctions between Sanders and Trump, but Sanders is tapping into that economic anxiety and that anger, the anger that is felt.
Сандерс вмешивается, разделяет эту экономическую обеспокоенность и гнев.
I'll come back to Sanders in a minute, but I think it's the consensus view on the part of many Americans, especially journalists, that, wait a minute, I can do this, that the person who's most interested, no, I won't do the Trump, is Donald Trump. He has captured the attention of Americans not in a necessarily positive way. Go ahead and say that.
Сейчас я это скажу. Человек, который выиграл больше всего, это Дональд Трамп.
Just anecdotally, as I was waiting for my plane to come here, I get to everything early. I was sitting in the airport's lounge being forced to watch TV, and I was there for an hour and a half.
Вот такой анекдот. Я слишком рано приехал, как обычно, в аэропорт, когда сюда летела. Вынужден был 1,5 часа смотреть там телевизор.
Watching CNN.
CNN.
And a little joke, that's about the only place anyone watches CNN these days, is in an airport. But anyway, you do speak English, I knew it! All right, you got my joke. But anyway, for an hour and a half, it was nothing but Donald Trump. I mean, he literally, his face, his image was not on CNN, except for the commercials, for an hour and a half.
Я понимаю, что сейчас по доброй воле CNN никто не смотрит, но все эти 1,5 часа не показывали исключительно Трампа, больше никого.
So we need to explain that too. Now, but the other reason, I mean, there's such a complex cultural historical dynamic going on here. We could teach an entire class about this. I mean, an entire semester I could talk about this easily, maybe a whole career.
Тут очень сложная политическая динамика, можно целый семестр ее изучать.
But what is most important perhaps to say at the very beginning is how unsettling Trump is for much of the American intelligentsia and political establishment, and for, I would argue, personal point here, for very good reason. Go ahead and say that.
Здесь очень важно сказать, насколько большое беспокойство Трамп вызывает у большой части американской интеллигенции.
This is a good place for me to stop and underscore something. I am speaking for myself. I don't speak for the Brookings Institution, for George Washington University, or for the American State Department.
Здесь очень важно подчеркнуть, что я говорю исключительно от своего личного имени, а не от какой-либо организации.
This is also on the record, if there are any journalists out there. So a colleague of mine at the Brookings Institution, who is a well-known American intellectual, but also a neoconservative, somebody who is not a conventional liberal anyway, and even though he's at the Brookings Institution. This is an article from the Washington Post this morning. It's a column. And look at the headline that Kagan is using. And this is not uncommon language to use to describe the Donald Trump phenomenon.
Вот мой коллега, который неоконсерватор, в каком-то смысле либерал, и вот он написал статью, посмотрите, какой заголовок. И такие заголовки сейчас не редкость.
I need to underscore some maybe subtle cultural points. This is the Washington Post. It doesn't get any more establishment than the Washington Post and the New York Times.
Я должна подчеркнуть, что это публикация Washington Post, а нет больше газет, которые представляют эстеблишмент, кроме как Washington Post и New York Times.
Robert Kagan is, again, a well-known historian and also a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Again, it doesn't get more establishment than the Brookings Institution.
Роберт Каган очень респектабельный сотрудник Brookings Institution, историк.
So this has become a part of the analysis of some pretty conventional mainstream American political observers and institutions and newspapers.
То есть это результат анализа, выполненного очень респектабельными американскими политическими обозревателями и организациями.
We could go into this is too long, except for the point of if you read English well, you can get a sense of it. But what he's saying essentially here is that Trump is not a conventional Republican by any stretch of the imagination, at least a modern-day conventional mainstream Republican, in that he looks a bit more like a right-wing European sort of phenomenon, anti-immigrant. You know, and also, well, as Kagan says, that his feelings of resentment, he's tapping into feelings of resentment and disdain intermingled with bits of fear, hatred, and anger.
Трамп не является типичным республиканцем, он скорее похож на европейского правого. В этом его феномен. Он культивирует ненависть и презрение и гнев по отношению к иммигрантам и другим.
The objects of his rhetoric include Muslims, certainly, Hispanics. You know, his main claim to fame is sort of like Pink Floyd. You know, he's going to build the wall. It's the wall all the time. He's going to build a beautiful wall across the southern part of the United States.
Как Pink Floyd все время собирается везде строить большую красивую стену через всю Америку.
And the concern and antipathy towards Trump and the Trump message comes not just from the left wing of the United States or from the establishment. I want you to notice here too, this is the National Review is perhaps the principal news outlet for opinion of conventional Republicans. And so this is a screenshot of the National Review founded by a fellow named William Buckley several decades ago. The patron saint of the National Review is Ronald Reagan, and their concern is the death of Reagan's Republican Party.
Вот это National Review, традиционный рупор традиционных республиканцев, и Рейган у них считается практически святым покровителем. Вот заголовок: смерть республиканской партии Рейгана.
So the concerns about Trump come from all across different aspects of the American political establishment, with one exception. He's loved by, and he's been voted for by about 10 million Americans. Who are they and why?
То есть Трамп вызывает озабоченность в самых разных точках американского политического истеблишмента, с одним исключением. Его обожают, и за него проголосовали около 10 миллионов американцев. Почему?
So part of the answer, now I'm going to step back and say a part of the answer has to do with the experience as a result of the collapse in 2008.
Значит, какой ответ на этот вопрос? Первая часть ответа – это опыт, возникший в результате экономического коллапса в 2008 году.
Certainly not all of, but it is a bit of a trope, it's a bit of a conventional understanding that many of Trump's supporters are working class Americans lacking a college education, factory workers, tradespersons, people who are builders of one sort or another, people who have relied on factory jobs in their respective cities across the United States.
Все понимают, что многие избиратели Трампа – это рабочие без высшего образования, которые рассчитывали на свою работу на заводах, расположенных в различных частях Америки.
Remember the slide I showed you about the growing wealth disparities in the United States?
Помните про распределение богатства и растущий разрыв между богатыми и бедными?
The top 20%, which is a pretty big group, but the top 20% has generally benefited, the top 1% has benefited even more, whereas the bottom half of the country has experienced a net decline in their wealth, in their well-being.
Верхние 20%, что достаточно много, забрали себе все богатство, но верхний 1% еще даже больше себе забрали, но остальные-то остались не у дела.
They've seen their factory jobs leave the United States. They've seen their livelihoods evaporate. They've seen the prospect of their children leading a better life, which is called the American dream, evaporate.
Они видят, что их рабочие места на заводах изгоняются из США в другие страны, видят, что жить становится невозможно, что у их детей практически нет шансов вести такую же жизнь, как они.
Let me pause for a second. I come from Washington, D.C. and all of that, but I was born in a place called Flint, Michigan.
Я сейчас живу в Вашингтоне, но родился я в городе под названием Флинт, Мичиган.
And here in St. Petersburg, I'm seeing some of you say, oh, you even this far away, Flint has a resonance with you. You've probably heard about the drinking water crisis, but the crisis of Flint started many, many years ago. I left Flint in 1974, a long, long time ago, and when I left, there were about 16 factories still operating in Flint.
Даже в Петербурге название Флинт многим знакомо. Кризис, который там был. Я уехала из этого города в 1974 году, и на тот момент там было 16 заводов.
My father spent 42 years as a factory worker, working in the factory on the assembly line.
Мой отец 42 года проработал на заводе.
I had 3 older brothers. who also worked on the assembly
У
line.
меня было 3 старших брата, которые тоже работали на конвейере.
Collectively, my family put in about 140 years
Все вместе члены моей семьи около 140 лет отдали работе на заводе.
in those factories in Flint.
Во Флинте.
They're all gone. They're all gone. All those factories are gone.
Ни одного из этих заводов больше не существует.
So, you know, I have a personal insight into how they feel about this. Their livelihood is gone. I was lucky. There's a Russian angle to this. Can we just do a little? I think sometimes people like to hear anecdotes to humanize this person who's talking to you.
Я стал единственным исключением.
My father, when he worked in the factory, had a close friend. His name was Nazark. Mr. Nazark left Russia in 1917 and worked next to my father for many, many years.
У моего отца на заводе был друг господин Нейзарк, который мигрировал из России в 17 году и проработал на этом заводе много лет.
His name is actually Isaac Nazark.
Его звали Исаак Нейзарк.
Isaac Nazark's son, Bill, he became Americanized, right? Second generation. Bill Nazark also worked in the factory.
Его сын Билл, который втором поколении американизировался, тоже работал.
And my father in 1974, when I graduated from high school, took me to talk to Bill Nazark at his home and say, Bill, give my son a job.
Когда я закончил школу в 1974 году, мой папа отвел меня к этому Биллу домой и попросил его, дай моему сыну работу.
And you're going to have to do an American inflected accent here. I can remember this conversation very clearly. Bill Nazark, the son, said, Frank, there just ain't no jobs here. He didn't speak Southern. He said, Frank, we ain't got no jobs. Ain't got no jobs. That's important. About 2/3 of us are all in on the same joke, aren't we? So that is, you know, keep that just anecdote, not all these numbers, but just keep that story in mind to understand Trump and Sanders. And that's the point. Remember, I'm trying to explain to myself and to you why Trump and Sanders.
Эту историю важно помнить, чтобы объяснить феномен Трампа и Сандерса. И я все время о них вспоминаю, когда думаю, почему они.
And a part of the explanation is that both Trump and Sanders are tapping into that anger about 2008. They're tapping into that anger about the growing wealth disparities, and they're speaking to the same people, but there's an important distinction between a Trump and a Sanders supporter that eventually I need to underscore and make clear.
И Трамп и Сандерс говорят именно об этом, о том, что волнует людей, о кризисе 2008 года, о потере работы, но есть существенное отличие между человеком, поддерживающим одного и другого.
So let's talk a little bit now. You've got the background. How much time do I have? How are we doing?
35 minutes altogether.
More?
40 minutes.
Okay. So that's the remember I said, to understand media, to understand information technology and elections, it's important to put it in a context. What I've just done is establish sort of the predicate, the premise for now going into a bit of a discussion about the internet.
Чтобы понимать влияние интернета и социальных СМИ, важно поместить их в контекст, что я только что попытался сделать.
So let's begin with Trump and understand how he has utilized social media, especially Twitter, in this election cycle.
Начнем с Трампа. Как он использовал социальные сети, в первую очередь Twitter.
If you were to Google this, you would find, just Google three-legged stool, you'll find this analysis everywhere. So this, again, I'm not offering you anything that's not, you know, the part of the general analysis that one finds.
Если вы наберете вот слова «на трех назад», то этот политологический анализ вы найдете везде, это метафора, поэтому не буду о них подробно рассказывать.
So, you know, metaphorically, we've got three sort of interlocking support mechanisms for Trump's use of media.
То есть есть три взаимоподдерживающих механизма использования Трампа в СМИ.
They're independent and reinforcing of one another.
Они зависят друг от друга и усиливают друг друга.
And it works something like this, though where you begin in the cycle is rather arbitrary. You could pick up, I could take number 4 and turn it into number 1. So it's a cyclical process.
Нумерация здесь условная. Можно четверку сделать единицу. Это циклический процесс.
But we can begin by saying that Mr. Trump tweets something rather outrageous. He's brilliant at the use of 140 characters.
Начинается, вначале Трамп пишет в Твиттере что-то такое невероятное. Он очень хорошо умеет умещать мысли в 140 символов.
It has nothing to do with policy. He offers no policy proposals.
Никаких политических предложений в плане решения проблем это не содержит.
It has nothing to do with anything other than insulting other people or being outrageous in some way with his tweets.
Не более чем оскорбление других людей или просто что-то из рамок выходящее.
For example, we'll come back to this. No, we'll stick with that. He has criticized the appearance of other candidates' spouses. In other words, he said that he has the... I have to pause here for a second. I'm going to end up mirroring things that Donald Trump says, and they make me uncomfortable. But I have to do it to get across the idea.
Например, он раскритиковал то, что другие кандидаты появляются на публике со своими супругами. Мне некомфортно, даже неприятно об этом говорить, но я должен это сделать.
I, in my personal character, do not like being vulgar.
Мне лично не нравится быть вульгарным.
He has called one of his opponent's wife, Senator Cruz's wife, unattractive relative to Trump's wife.
Он назвал жену Круза непривлекательной по сравнению со своей собственной женой.
He, with a presumed correlation in anatomical parts of the human body, he's held his hand up and said, I ain't got no problem. No, I haven't got a problem. There's no problem here.
Он комментировал анатомические особенности тела.
In other words, he is boasting about the size of his manly parts.
Другими словами, он хвастался размером своего мужского достоинства.
This isn't a conventional behavior on the part of an American presidential candidate.
Это не традиционное поведение для американского кандидата в президенты.
Now, keep in mind, I am from a white working class background in the Middle West.
При этом не забывайте, что я сам происхожу из белого рабочего среднего класса на Среднем Западе.
And I have a lot of respect for my fellow white working class Midwesterners.
И я очень уважаю своих других американских рабочих.
But that sort of thing is somehow, yeah, he's telling it like it is. He doesn't pull any punches, is the conclusion to these tweets. He doesn't conform to political correctness.
Но он ничего не стесняется в своих твитах, он не соблюдает политкорректность.
There's a certain degree of gender and race animus, resentment that he is tapping into.
Он играет на гендерной и расовой нетерпимости.
So that's just giving you a sense of the kinds of things he's tweeting. But then there's the next step. The outrageousness of what he tweets ends up feeding the 24-hour news cycle found on CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC.
То, что он твитнул, потом 24 часа обсуждают все новостные каналы.
Let me ask you a question. What's the greatest challenge? You are now in charge of CNN. What's your greatest challenge besides getting people to vote?
Если бы вы сейчас возглавили CNN, какая бы у вас была самая большая проблема выборов?
What is your greatest challenge? It's midnight. You're looking at your greatest challenge. It's midnight.
Вот сейчас полночь, какой у вас самый большой челлендж?
What is it you have to do next?
Что вам нужно сделать?
What do you think?
You have to constantly throw something new and interesting, some small bites.
Exactly. You've got 24 hours of airtime to fill with something.
У вас 24 часа эфирного времени, которые нужно чем-то заполнить.
Now, if you're Fox News, you often fill it with people yelling at one another.
На Fox News можно просто показывать, как люди орут друг на друга.
But for the longest time, a CNN program was broadcast out of my building, and the people who were on this program were on my floor, and I listened to them plan the program every day.
CNN работает у меня в здании, я часто слышу, как сотрудники обсуждают, что им показывают.
It was called Crossfire, and it became notorious for people yelling at one another.
Это называется перекрестный огонь, и это когда люди кричат друг на друга.
But the common denominator of people yelling at one another and other content is it's a spectacle. It's entertaining. It's sort of like a car accident. You can't help but watch.
С другой стороны, это зрелище, это развлечение, это интересно смотреть.
So there you have it. American television news like a car accident.
То есть американские теленовости стали похожи на ДТП.
But this is in the next part. Donald Trump, who is, look, I'm even starting to do the Trump thing. Donald Trump, who tweets something outrageous, then ends up, the outrageousness of it ends up becoming fuel for the next 24-hour news cycle.
То есть после того, как Трамп выкладывает какой-то невероятный твит, это становится основанием для следующих суток на ТВ.
Oh, and I've missed something here too. There should be another point that I see I didn't put up. Large rallies end up becoming even larger and more raucous. Raucous, you know, kind of like it's unruly.
При этом большие собрания встречи становятся еще крупнее, там еще больше людей, еще более энергично они проходят.
Even with a slight tinge of potential violence or actual violence.
Там даже возможно как-то в сторону насилия.
And this spurs additional social media buzz, so the tweets and the Facebook posts and the Snapchat postings all accelerate.
Это порождает дополнительный шум в соцсетях.
Which helps him book his next television appearance, which would lead to the explanation as why I could sit and watch a television and for an hour and a half it was nothing but Donald Trump.
И благодаря этому он попадает на свое следующее телевизионное интервью. И это объясняет, почему я 1,5 часа смотрел одного Трампа.
There are some important distinctions, I think, that could be made, that if we had more time we could go into, but there is a general sense that Trump's use of social media takes what President Obama did during his 2 campaigns, but takes it to a different level.
То, как он использует соцсети, это похоже на то, что делал Обама оба срока, но выводит на новый уровень.
Certainly President Obama was revolutionary in a small r sort of sense, or innovative in his use of social media for attracting followers, for raising funds. Trump is taking that and adding to it in interesting ways.
Конечно, Обама совершил настоящую революцию в использовании соцсетей, как он привлекал сторонников и собирал средства. Трамп тоже этим пользуется и выводит на следующий уровень, но немножко иначе.
I would say, and I hope it's not just simply a reflection of political bias, but one of the distinctions, though, between Trump and Obama is that Obama drew attention to himself by the strength of his ability to write eloquent prose in his books that he published before president, because of his articulate nature, his policy vision. I say that again, I want to underscore. Let me be clear, I voted for Ronald Reagan at one point in my life, so I'm not being necessarily partisan here. It's simply the case that if you look at the character, I know I'm going on too long, if you look at the character of the two men, Trump is drawing attention to himself through vulgarity, Obama drew attention to himself because of his intelligence.
Но Обама привлекал к себе внимание благодаря своему красноречию, книгам, которые он написал до того, как стать еще президентом. Я должен подчеркнуть, что я когда-то голосовал за Рейгана, но тем не менее необходимо быть объективным. Обама привлекал к себе внимание благодаря своей интеллигентности какой-то, а Трамп через свою вульгарность.
So maybe the bottom line here is to note, according to a recent analysis of the New York Times, if you were to add up all of the attention that Trump has received on the news media, and if he were to have to pay for that, as you would conventionally through advertising, he would have had to spend $2 billion for the amount of airtime that he's gotten for free. This analysis is about 2 weeks old, so it's probably not close to $8 billion.
Посчитали, что если бы все эфирное время, которое Трамп получил благодаря своим постам, если бы он это все оплачивать должен был в качестве рекламы, то это стоило бы $2 миллиарда.
This is an analysis by something called Hootsuite, which is one of the various ways in which you can analyze the effects of social media. I don't have time to get into the details of it here, except to say that you have impact, engagement, reach, sentiment, authenticity. These have been defined in the research to mean particular things, and a quantitative analysis is done by Hootsuite. This was published by, Fortune magazine, which again is a mainstream economic journal, nothing extreme about it. And you can see that Trump, according to this assessment, Trump has been really quite successful in the use of social media for all the reasons I've explained.
Вот анализ использования соцсетей механизмов Pursuit, который был опубликован в журнале Fortune по 5 критериям, я не буду подробно вдаваться, но здесь воздействие, увлечение, достижение, чувство и подлинность. Каждый из этих критериев имеет определение, и, в общем, можно видеть, что Трамп очень успешно использовал социальные сети по этому анализу.
However, I haven't talked about Bernie Sanders at all, really, to speak of at all. Sanders is just as effective, in fact, more effective using social media than has been Trump.
Однако Сандерс, о котором мы до сих пор еще и не говорили, использует соцсети не менее эффективно, чем Трамп.
Not quite, the impact score isn't quite as high as Trump's, but the other scores are higher than Trump's. But it's a very different dynamic. Trump is driving his own social media frenzy, and Sanders is simply the recipient of other people's use of social media to talk about him. You see the difference that I'm making? In other words, Trump is more responsible for his own Twitter profile, his own social media profile, whereas Sanders is the recipient of a more general sense of attention given to him on social media by other Americans.
Но есть разница. Трамп сам проактивно создает свой профиль в соцсетях, он сам пишет в Твиттере, а Сандерс является больше получателем, реципиентом того, что о нем пишут.
So if you were to look at these hashtags, for instance, these are some of the hashtags that Sanders supporters are using. You can see with an average of more than 2,000 retweets per hour, it's the Sanders supporters who are driving his attention on social media. You can see comparatively here. I'm sorry, go ahead.
То есть, если вы посмотрите вот этот хэштег Fielded, то можно увидеть, что это сторонники Сандерса поддерживают внимание к нему. Более 2000 ретвитов за час.
This is a kind of a rough metric, but think about this. 2,000 retweets relative to Clinton's 425. Even relative to Trump's 729 retweet per hour sort of metric.
Это гораздо больше, чем у Клинтона и даже у Трампа.
So here, the conclusion of this analysis, these are not my words, this is a screenshot, but the conclusion is, so much of the social media outpouring around Sanders seems to be spontaneous rather than strategized, a testament to the original power of social media as a collective voice.
Социальный вот этот взрыв вокруг Сандерса представляется больше спонтанным, чем стратегически спланированным. Это действительно такой глаз народа.
So the question then becomes, well, what happens in the election? So
Let's move on. I feel the pressure. I want to give you a chance to talk and ask questions. But one of the questions that we are left with,
despite the fact that Trump seems to be such an object of attention, is not necessarily positive attention. It's not necessarily attention that's going to win him the White House. We'll have to see.
One of the driving considerations is found within this part of this graph.
Но внимание, которое привлекается через соцсети, может быть не только положительным. И вот нужно обратить внимание на следующее.
This is about a month old, so it's April 2016.
I got this off the Washington Post this morning, though, so it's the most recent that they've posted.
Вот последний опрос месяц назад проводился, но Вашингтон-Пост его опубликовали сегодня утром, значит, более свежих нет.
You can see the question, the survey question that's being asked. Overall, do you have a favorable or unfavorable impression of Donald Trump?
Вопрос: в целом Трамп производит на вас положительное или отрицательное впечатление?
And among registered voters, people who can vote, it's 66% of the respondents say they have an unfavorable opinion of Donald Trump.
И из зарегистрированных избирателей 66% сказали, что впечатление не благоприятное.
You might be confused, and you might be asking yourself, well, if he's so unpopular, why is he the presumptive nominee of the Republican Party?
It has to do with the fact that this poll is asked all registered voters.
He's popular within the part of the American population that identifies with the Republican Party, and there's complexities as to how they vote and all of that.
But Trump is tapping into a subset of the American population.
Нужно обратить внимание, что этот опрос проводится только среди зарегистрированных избирателей, а только непонятно, почему же он тогда будет республиканским кандидатом.
So with all Americans, Trump is not very popular. I suspect this number hasn't moved very much. I mean, if you were to round it off, 70% of the American public have a disfavorable view of Donald Trump.
В целом по Америке Трамп не очень популярен. Я подозреваю, что если данные не сильно изменились, и около 70% американцев Трампа не одобряют.
Is that good news for Hillary Clinton?
Хорошо ли это для Хиллари?
Maybe.
I don't think so.
Who do you suppose of the major American presidential candidates has the second highest unfavorability ratings?
Как вы считаете, у кого следующий по неблагоприятности рейтинг кандидатов?
Who do you suppose that is?
Hillary.
Hillary Clinton. She's in, I don't remember in post, I didn't pull it off the post, but last time I paid attention it was in the 50th percentile.
Я не помню точно, какой у нее результат, я не сохранил, но 50 с чем-то процентов было.
Which brings us to Bernie Sanders.
Что приводит нас к теме Сандерса.
Now, there is so much going on here about delegates and primaries and caucuses that we can't go through it here. You're going to have to just go with this for a little bit. What you have here is a graphic representation of the distribution of votes according to states for the Democratic candidate for the general election. And this light colored blue is the total number of Hillary Clinton delegates as of this morning.
Ну, не вдаваясь в подробности, вот голубое, это сколько проголосовали за выдвижение Хиллари.
The purple are those allocated to Bernie Sanders.
Фиолетовый за Сандерса.
Some of Hillary Clinton's delegate supporters are a special category called superdelegates, and they are nominally committed to Hillary Clinton, but Bernie Sanders' strategy right now is to convince the 500 or so superdelegates to switch to him because she is simply not performing very well in any of the state-to-state primaries, the elections that happen state after state after state throughout this very long year.
Среди 2000 ее сторонников есть 500 так называемых суперделегатов, которые как бы обязаны голосовать за нее, но стратегия Сандерса сейчас заключается в том, чтобы перевести их на свою сторону, потому что Хиллари очень нехорошо показывает себя на всех праймерис.
Russian is a much more efficient language than Arabic. I've been translated into Arabic, and I would say something very, short sentence, and then the Arabic would just go on and on. Really? Anyway. The key to who the Democratic nominee is going to be rests right here under my hand. The remaining delegates that are up yet for contestation, for winning in an election. California is the big one coming up.
Вот оставшиеся серые 900 делегатов, это те, которые еще не определились. И они решат, кто станет демократическим кандидатом. Среди них Калифорния.
And Bernie Sanders is going to try to win California, which will convince the other delegates who have committed to Hillary Clinton to switch to him. He actually polls more strongly against Trump than Hillary Clinton does. He's the stronger candidate.
И Сандерс постарается выиграть Калифорнию, что может заставить 500 делегатов, которые обязались поддерживать Хиллари, отказаться от этого решения. По сравнению в борьбе с Трампом, Сандерс более сильный кандидат, чем Хиллари.
This is a long quote. Again, this is from today's newspaper that's talking about the strategy that Sanders is putting into this race. It essentially says he's going to stick with it. There's a concern that he's doing damage to Hillary Clinton. He's damaging her credibility. He's damaging her ability to eventually beat Donald Trump in the general election. He's saying, apparently so far, he's saying that there needs to be structural changes. He's sticking with the election, is basically what that quote is saying. He's not backing down in the least. He still expects, even though mathematically difficult, he still expects to win.
Вот сегодня вышла публикация, там написано в целом, что Сандерс подрывает авторитет Клинтона, он ставит под сомнение ее возможность успешно победить Трампа, и несмотря на то, что математически у него уже мало шансов стать кандидатом, он не выбывает из кампании.
Here is the similar graph, but for the Republicans, I need to simplify it a little bit by just pointing out that the yellow represents Donald Trump delegates that are already committed to the elections that have happened already, state to state. These are the ones that have been committed to Donald Trump. These are Ted Cruz delegates, and others, once they reach the convention, they'll sort out who actually gets the nomination. Right now, it looks pretty clear that Donald Trump will get the nomination for a variety of reasons. However,
вот аналогичная диаграмма для республиканцев, не вдаваясь в подробности, видно, что желтый это голоса за Трампа, и уже понятно, что он станет кандидатом.
However, there is so much concern on the part of the Republican Party about having Donald Trump as their nominee that there is still talk about contesting his nomination at the national convention coming up in Cleveland in July. There's talk about running a third-party candidate, somebody, it wouldn't be Mitt Romney, but somebody like Mitt Romney.
Настолько большой беспокойность республиканской партии вызывает выдвижение Трампа, что по-прежнему ведутся разговоры о том, чтобы оспорить его выдвижение на большой конвенции, которая будет в Кливленде в июле. Может быть, попытаться с кандидатом от третьей партии, которым может стать, например, Митт Ромни.
So even at this point, it's not clear. So isn't this interesting? Both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are in some bit of upheaval. And I would argue the underlying cause in both instances has to do with that economic crisis that's leading a lot of middle class and working class Americans to revolt against whether it's the Democrats who are blamed sometimes as much as the Republicans for what led to the 2008 election.
В обеих партиях царит раздрай, и одной из причин для этого, я считаю, является экономический кризис. Избиратели обвиняют в своих бедах то демократов, то республиканцев.
There's another underlying complex concept here that I won't have a chance to actually share with you. It has to do with a concept called the Electoral College and how it's allocating votes. But the long and short of it is that, and this is a week old, if the election were held today or a week ago, Hillary Clinton would trounce Donald Trump in the general election. Even though she's relatively weak next to Bernie Sanders, Sanders would even perform more strongly. But with this estimation, state-by-state polling, Hillary Clinton would have 347 electoral college votes. You need 270. This would be one of the largest landslide victories in American presidential history. One of the largest.
Если изучать коллегию выборщиков, которую вы наверняка знаете, то если бы выборы состоялись сегодня, то Клинтон легко бы победила Трампа. Она бы набрала 347 голосов, в то время как для победы нужно 270. Это более чем убедительная победа, хотя Сандерс, если бы он был кандидатом, выступил бы еще лучше.
I need to say something. You may be looking at this map and confused because it looks like the red, Trump, has won more than the blue, Clinton. But what the driver underneath this is the population of the states, not the size of the state. These are small population states.
Тут кажется непонятно, потому что вроде красного географически больше, чем голубого. То есть Трамп должен победить, но красный это штат с маленьким населением.
Whereas this is California, New York, the Eastern Seaboard, from Boston to New York. These are large population states, so they have more of the votes that go into the determination of that outcome.
Синий штат это Калифорния, Нью-Йорк, восточное побережье, там много очень народу.
I have more I can say, probably about another 20 minutes more, but I don't think I have 20 minutes more to share with you. So the long and short of it is, the conclusion of this is that to understand how Trump especially is using social media, you have to understand the political dynamics that are underneath the messages that are being offered on the social media.
Я мог бы еще долго говорить, к сожалению, у нас нет больше времени, но еще раз хочу повторить важную мысль, чтобы понять, каким образом Трамп использует соцсети, важно понять контекст, который стоит за этим использованием соцсетей.
And the bottom, the summary statement is that since 2008 and even before, there has been a bit of an institutional crisis on the part of some parts of American politics that Trump has tapped into. So has Bernie Sanders. I recall I obligated myself to explain something. Trump is reaching working class voters by appealing to some of their more base instincts, to offer explanations for working class conditions because of the other, because of Latinos.
Еще до 2008 года в американской политике возник кризис, которым успешно воспользовались и Трамп, и Сандерс. Трамп вызывает к избирателям из рабочего класса к низменным инстинктам, чтобы они помогают им в своих бедах обвинить других, например, латиноамериканцев.
So Trump is being a bit demagogic. He's reaching out to base instincts and anger, whereas Sanders isn't entirely free from this, but mostly he is focused on explanation or on a message having to do with the nature of the banking system and of modern capitalism and of neoliberalism. So his explanation is substantively different than Trump's. So this is separating the motivations between the two groups.
Сандерс тоже не совсем свободен от этого, но все-таки он больше объясняет систему современного капитализма, неолиберализма, то есть он подходит к этим группам с другой стороны.
If it's okay with you, I'm going to stop talking right now and give you a chance to ask some questions or give me a chance to clarify anything that I've left unclear.
Если вы не возражаете, я перестану говорить на этой точке, чтобы вы могли задать вопросы или, может быть, пояснить подробнее.
10 minutes do we have?
Есть у нас еще 10 минут?
10 to 15.
Yeah. So, please. Yes, sir.